It's time for Talking History on KSMU, a monthly show produced by Missouri State University Department of History. I'm Djene Patrick.
And I'm Patrick Needham.
Today we're joined by Jeremy Neely, an associate professor here in the Department of History at Missouri State University. He is the author of Border Between Them, Violence and Reconciliation on the Kansas-Missouri Line, published in 2011, and he teaches classes on the Civil War, Reconstruction, and military history here at Missouri State University. Today we'll be talking about his forthcoming book, A Union Tested.
A Union Tested follows the 400 letters shared between an Illinois homemaker, Cimbaline Fike, and her husband Henry, a schoolteacher turned soldier in the Union Army. Letters which reveal how an ordinary American family adapted to the extraordinary circumstances of the Civil War. Dr. Neely, welcome to Talking History.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I wanted to begin by asking you to tell us a little bit about this couple, the Fikes. Who were they, and how did you come across this collection of correspondence?
I lucked into this collection. As it often goes, I wasn't expecting to study this particular family who ended up in Missouri after the Civil War. I'd originally planned on writing a book about Missouri in the post-Civil War period, looking at Reconstruction. And one of the collections that I did find was the diary from Henry Fike. And I discovered that he had kept a diary from the early 1850s into the early 20th century, almost every year. And that's an extraordinary find for a historian to be able to track someone over so much time. And given how prolific he was, I wondered if he had written anything else. So I did a bit of digging and discovered that he had written letters to his wife, Cimbaline, during the war. But those had been kept in another repository. So over to the University of Kansas I went, and I dove in and was immediately fascinated.
So much of the scholarship of the Civil War emphasizes how the Northern home front escaped the kinds of dislocations experienced in the South, where most of the fighting took place. Your book, however, suggests that the war destabilized civilian life in the U.S. more than previously recognized. What were the biggest challenges that people in the North and Western border states faced?
We have this tendency to turn the Civil War into a kind of binary. There's the North, there's the South, there's the Union, there's the Confederacy. But what I study, and what an increasing number of scholars are studying, is this border region where the North and the South bled into each other. And it's in this kind of fractious middle ground where things get really messy. And this is where the Fikes had lived in Illinois. They were just across the river from St. Louis in a small town called Mascoutah. And after the war, they end up in western Missouri, near Warrensburg. And what I found interesting about both places, but during the war they're mostly in Mascoutah, is how this is a Union state, Illinois, where the President Abraham Lincoln is from. And it's a town where most of the people are clearly loyal to the Union cause. Most of the adult men who fight go off to fight for the United States. But there are, in these guys' absence, real tensions laid bare between the folks who are left behind. You have violent clashes between loyalists and what were called then copperheads, the people who in the North were against the war or against Lincoln. And I discovered that Cimbaline Fike was really a wonderful lens into all of this, because she doesn't hold back. She's very willing to speak her mind, and she's talking about the threats to her physical safety as criminals start to prowl the streets at night. She's talking about her anger towards these folks who she thinks are disloyal, and it's a really tense place.
So you've said that Cimbaline Fike is the heart of this book. What does she add? What does her story add to our understanding of the Civil War, how it transformed, people's consciousness, and how it affected women on the home front?
The thing that jumped out about her first is that she is very recognizable. She grows during the war. She begins her letters to her husband, and he's going to be gone for a 3-year enlistment, and he will occasionally be allowed to come home, but it's a prolonged absence. she begins her correspondence barely able to string together a couple of sentences. Her first few letters are a little more than a paragraph. But over the course of writing to him 100 letters, she is going to become this forceful writer. And by the end of the war, she's turning out these letters a dozen pages long. And she adds to the existing understanding of the Civil War that shows us that women are, not just sort of tending things at home and the war is something that happens elsewhere, but she is immersed in it. She's actively supporting the war in both ways, intimate and civic. She's sending to her husband socks and pants and underwear and butter and all kinds of comforts from home. She is the leader of the local Unions League, which is a women's civic organization that raises money for soldiers. She picks lint, which is how bandages were often created for Civil War soldiers, that the women at home would pick the lint from their laundry. And so she's immersed in what's happening, even though she's often to a degree unaware. I mean, her husband is going to inform her what he's up to, but it's always a delayed kind of awareness. She's also recognizable in the ways that she's a single parent during the war, and she's taking care of a precocious toddler named Ellie. And she is not only responsible for what she had been doing prior to Henry's departure, which is the relentless domestic labor that she performed, taking care of the daughter, taking care of the home, laundry, food preparation, all of it, but she's now assuming the responsibility for what her husband had been doing and helping to pay the bills and to manage the farms that they have rented out. And it's a kind of labor that she steps up, and at first she's going to embrace this kind of independence, but it's a lot to carry. And I see in her something familiar in the 21st century of what many working parents come to know, that it's a lot of work to work outside of the home, but also to assume all of the responsibility of childcare. And it really wears on her. She struggles with chronic illness, what today we would recognize as probably clinical depression. But she has chronic pain. She has these lesions and carbuncles. She eventually has to have all of her bottom teeth removed over the course of the war. And so I think Cimbaline shows us that the development of medical science and the treatment of disease during the war wasn't just a phenomenon that's, helping out the soldiers, that people on the home front are it was a tough life.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating story. She's taking responsibility for the social reproduction. She's taking responsibility for the family business. But also, as you highlight, she is, over the course of the war, increasingly engaged in civic political life. She's not simply a homemaker, but she is an active citizen in the United States. Would you say her experience during the war, this transformation from, a semi-literate homemaker who is confined to the domestic sphere to a literate citizen, even though they women don't have voting rights, but an active participant in civil society, is this transformation, would you say, was common for women of her class?
That's a great question. I think that, to a degree, yes, it was common, that she's not alone. There are dozens of women in her community of about 2,000 that step forward and enthusiastically embrace the opportunities that they can. That this was an era in which women could not vote, they could not hold office, but it was widely accepted that they were performing duties that were extensions of their responsibilities as homemakers and helping to take care of their men while they were away at war. And I wonder about the degree to which her experiences during the war shaped her life afterward, but it remains a big question mark, because the war proves to be this interlude in which she's writing a lot, but then when her husband comes home, she's no longer writing, and so we don't know. But the most interesting part, I should add, about her wartime letters are the ways in which she's really pushing against gender expectations about how women should behave. Because during the war, very, very few women will take up arms in military service. But during the course of the war, as she's raging against her Copperhead neighbors, she's talking about how she wishes she could put on breeches and shoulder a rifle. One 4th of July, she has sewn together a flag for both her Union League and the Union League of local men. But when she hears that local Copperheads are considering running up a Confederate flag on Independence Day, she exclaims she wishes she could grab an axe and run down to the square where this flagpole is and chop it down. And so she's asserting this kind of this tendency towards violence and direct action that really stands in the face of what 19th century women were supposed to be. That is domestic, sort of retiring and nurturing. She pushes back against that.
And a part of that is probably due to the circumstance of being largely alone on the home front, right?
Mm-hmm.
And could you go into more detail or about what threats faced families on the home front in these border areas? Because we're not talking about just Southern Illinois. We're talking about Kentucky, the Ozarks.
Sure.
Yeah,
these border states are a difficult place because it really is the meeting ground of people with different loyalties. It is the blending of Northerners and Southerners. And it's a region where a lot of people have come to identify themselves as Westerners. And it's a place where the original inhabitants, Native Americans, had just recently been dispossessed of their lands. And so it's been a violent place for a while. And what I see first coming off the pages are the psychological and the emotional costs that war brings, which I think are difficult for many people in the 21st century to wrap our minds around. Just the terror that in a state like Missouri, more than any other, where what the war looks like is guerrilla violence. The war isn't as much large conventional armies lining up and fighting against each other as it is small bands of irregular fighters in Missouri, most of them pro-Confederate, attacking loyal households as well as attacking local militiamen who are, part-time soldiers. And therefore the fear that just seems everywhere is, I think, the most striking challenge. And then over the course of the war, I think separation and the loneliness that comes with it just oozes from the pages. They always begin their letters by teasing one another about how long it's been since they've heard from their spouse. And on one hand, I know that's just sort of gentle, affectionate messing around, but there's something real there, that their absence is something they keenly feel.
So when we look at the impact of the Civil War on the home front in the North and the kind of stereotypes that give the idea that, people in the North weren't affected, it was only a Southern experience, whereas you're looking at this kind of in a broader perspective, looking at the border states and looking at how the war itself affects people very deeply, even if they're not super close to the fighting. Would you see then the American Civil War as less of a civil war and more of a revolution in the traditional sense of the word, in the way that it affects the consciousness of the people who are fighting it, how their experience during the war transforms them in very fundamental ways?
It is. It's the transformative experience of their lives. And I would argue it's the pivotal event in United States history. It is begun for the United States as a war to preserve the Union. And that's very much the way in which Henry Fike understands it. And to the degree that Cimbaline, she often goes by Lucy, her first name, that they understand it is that this is a war to save the nation. Over the course of the war, it becomes something else. And that is a war for what Lincoln eventually describes at Gettysburg, a new birth of freedom. And Henry and Cimbaline both come around and they embrace that too, that this is a struggle that will destroy slavery. And out of the ashes of slavery's destruction, there will come something different, a republic that now is going to live truer to its founding ideals, that all men are created equal, and that the liberty, affirmed in the Declaration of Independence is now going to be claimed and exercised by formerly enslaved people. It's a revolutionary moment in lots of ways. On the home front, what you see during the war is, in the assertion of government power through the draft, a real reckoning with what can a government ask of its citizens. And Henry does not volunteer to fight until the second year of the war. And I've never been able to piece together exactly why he waits for this year. But I suspect that after the war drags on for the first year and it's clear that there's no end in sight, he understands that his time to serve is now. And over the course of the war, that becomes a common theme for him and Cimbaline, is the sense that not all of their neighbors are doing their part, and that there are civic responsibilities which include taking up arms and enduring the sacrifices of prolonged separation. The draft, eventually, when it does come to Mascoutah, will be evaded by many local men. Some of them will flee town rather than to go into military service. There will come a black market in substitutes, because during the Civil War, if you did not want to enter military service, you could hire someone to take your place. And the substitute fee, it changes over time. And initially, what you could hire someone for a few $100s, by 1863 and 1864, Henry is finding that secondhand information from St. Louis, which is the city near Mascoutah, that there is now a thriving market for what he calls Uncle Sam's lottery. That there are many unwilling participants, and that some of these guys don't want to fight because they believe that this is now a war simply against slavery. Some of them have just been consistently reluctant to fight all along.
Can you tell us a little bit about how Cimbaline, or Lucy as she was known as at times, how her attitude towards the war and the issue of slavery developed over time? You know, was she aware of the issue of slavery at the beginning of the war, or was it not really in her vocabulary at that point? Was it something then that came later, or was it something that was always present to some degree or another in her position on the war?
That's a good question. I would say that early in the war, she's not talking about it directly, and certainly not at length. There is a small African-American population in Mascoutah. There is a much larger African-American population in St. Louis, much of it enslaved. And because the Fikes have gone across the river to trade somewhat, they have experience of encountering African Americans. But Cimbaline and Henry, before the war, have very limited experience to what slavery looks like. And Henry, whenever he first goes south, he will spend about a year in Memphis, Tennessee. It's his first personal encounters with enslaved people that really begin him reflecting upon what this is, the horrors of bondage, and what this will mean for the war. Cimbaline, because she's going to be back in Mascoutah for most of the war, she is not going to have that direct exposure, and I believe that's part of the reason that she doesn't write about it quite as extensively as her husband does. At each point of the war, whether he's in Mississippi or Alabama or Louisiana, with each encounter of African Americans, whether free or enslaved, it is a scene. He's a very careful documenter of everything, whether it's the landscape or the people. He reflects upon them with real interest.
Certainly, much has been written about the economic fallout of the Civil War. Obviously, what comes to mind is the South being completely reordered and the North booming, the industrial North booming. Could you tell us more about what the economy, how the war shaped the economy in these like Western borderlands?
That's a great question. Henry sees the transformations that the war is beginning to unleash as early as 1863 when he is in Memphis, because like many Western and Southern cities, Memphis becomes a hub, almost a magnet for the refugees that are going to be displaced by the war. You've got poor Southerners, black and white, who are going to retreat into the city because that is where they hope they will find safety in numbers. It's also where they hope that they can find work. And it's in Memphis where Henry starts to see the collapse of slavery. It becomes evident when he sees his first real plantations and the jubilation of formerly enslaved people once Union troops come to help liberate them. It is a time in the North of both opportunity and real instability, as I mentioned earlier. In the North, the Civil War is going to be an engine of economic growth because the United States government is going to equip and to feed and to fund the best prepared fighting force, certainly in U.S. history. And so northern farms and northern shops are really prospering. But at a household level, the Fikes are barely getting by. And one of the interesting discoveries that I came across was that prior to the war, Henry had gone fairly deeply into debt to buy more farmland because he was confident that, their prospects were strong. But then he goes off to fight the war, and now the creditors come calling. And she, because she's now responsible for their finances, has to confront him about this. And what I see in their letters is a couple really having to navigate some of the most intimate kinds of strains that I think any couple across any time period would recognize. And so the economic impacts of the war in the North and in the West are more complicated than they are in the South, but it's certainly right there in the background throughout everything.
Okay, so thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Neely. Can you tell us when a Union Tested will be available?
With luck, it will be available in 2024. I have completed the manuscript. It's gone through peer review. I've signed the contract, and hopefully University of Georgia Press will have it out into the world about a year from now.
Thank you for joining us, Dr. Neely. You've been listening to Talking History on KSMU, and if you would like to hear more from our conversation with Dr. Neely, check out our podcast, Talking History Extra, at ksmu.org.
Welcome to Talking History Extra. In the first part of our interview with Dr. Neely, we talked about Cimbaline Fike and how the Civil War transformed her consciousness, how the experience of war, changed her from domestic-orientated homemaker into an active participant in American civil society. But in this part, I want to turn to Henry Fikes and particularly talk about his experience in the Union Army, how that affected him, what motivated him to sign up, and then perhaps how the war changed and transformed his position, particularly on the question of slavery and race.
Henry, as a college-educated man, which was fairly unusual in the mid-19th century, is someone who likes to write. And so he talks about a lot of things. And it is going to become an increasing focus of his writing as he moves deeper into the South. The ways in which the war commenced for Union is becoming a war to also destroy slavery. He is a person who has, in his young life, benefited from African American labor. His family was relatively well off in Mascoutah. His parents had moved there in the early 19th century. His father had been born in South Carolina. And from his early diary, it seems that there had been African American servants working on the Fike farmstead all along. And so I think he had fairly well-established ideas about the ways in which race shapes who does what kind of labor. He's going to evolve over the course of the war. And I think this evolution is interesting, and I think it's reflective of other changes that are happening across the northern United States. in my classes, I often use Abraham Lincoln, but I think Henry Fike sort of fits within this too. Abraham Lincoln changes during the course of the war. Abraham Lincoln gets elected in 1860 as the Republican candidate, and so the nominee of an anti-slavery Northern Party. But Lincoln himself is not an abolitionist. He's always trying to find the middle ground, even within his own faction. But he will evolve. At the beginning of the war, Lincoln is very reluctant to do anything that would alienate conservative Unionists, including those in Missouri and Illinois and in Kentucky, which means that he's going to be very hesitant to try to emancipate slaves. But enslaved people are going to force the issue. They are going to take their fates into their own hands and begin to run away. And as they do, and they begin to show up into Army lines, they are now forcing the Army to make choices. Do we return these formerly enslaved people back to their slavers, or do we recognize their liberty? Do we protect them? Do we put them to work? And by 1863, Lincoln has come around and decided that emancipation is now a war aim. This is something that he can do in his capacity as commander-in-chief. And so he begins to move past his constitutional reservations. And by the end of the war, Lincoln will be hailed as the great emancipator, which is ironic because this certainly wasn't what he had set out to do when the war began. And in a similar way, Henry Fike begins the war with just reading the kind of racist language that he uses, who is comfortable and saying things that in the 21st century we would find really objectionable. But over the course of the war, he comes to develop real appreciation and respect for the men of color who step up and serve their country.
Now, how did that affect Henry's politics by the end of the war?
By the end of the war, Henry describes himself as a radical Republican. He had clearly been a Republican throughout, staunch Lincoln man, but his views on race become a more prominent part of his politics. He's certainly not the kind of radical that we will see in the Congress in the form of Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner or Thaddeus Stevens, the Speaker of the House, who are going to really champion this bold vision of remaking the South and bringing forth really a biracial republic. Henry Fike is more muted in his endorsement of civil rights for people of color, but he is consistent in maintaining that the post-Civil War republic must really deal with the problem of disloyalty, and that the people who have waged the rebellion, the Confederates, have to be purged from public life because as long as they continue to try to reestablish slavery by another name, that the gains of the war are always going to be fragile. And so I would say he's an indirect radical. He is primarily going to focus on economic development, internal improvements, they called them at the time, railroad promotion. But he does favor a much more robust system of public education. He was himself a school teacher and then a principal. And so he's quite forward-thinking in some ways. In other ways, he's still a product of his time.
So what you're saying, he's very much an individual who sees the power of the federal government as something that can be used to reconstruct society along a new model. And although he might not embrace African-American rights to the degree that some of the radicals in the Congress did, he did see the federal government as being this agent that would less work for the betterment of African Americans, but more as a vehicle to punish those who had been disloyal.
That's right. He embodies this kind of punitive streak in post-war political thought that many Union veterans share, that they have themselves sacrificed, having been in the military, in Henry's case, for almost 3 years, having seen many of their comrades die. And to now see former Confederates behaving as though the war hasn't changed anything, to people like Henry Fike, is deeply offensive. And so, yes, you see the emergence of a loosely defined kind of constitutionalism. He's not going to dwell upon this at length, but there are letters in which he makes clear that the antebellum notions of state sovereignty, in which the southern states can defy federal authority with impunity, that is a thing of the past. And so he has come out of the war changed.
These are all his questions of race and politics are pretty explicit in his writings. Is he as explicit at all? Does he develop at all on the question of gender and gender roles in society, given, separation from his wife for so long and her own evolution?
That's a great question, and the short answer is no. And I think this is also typical of many men of the Civil War generation, that the war and the military service of black men can kindle a much broader conception of who belongs in the body politic and who has rights and who should vote. But there are clear limits to that. And although he recognizes that his wife has shouldered a heavy set of responsibilities in his absence, it never transforms his sense of her as a political actor. Despite her civic leadership, there just seems to remain this hard and fast kind of gendered understanding of politics as a man's business for Henry Fike.
So I wanted to change tack a little bit and talk about teaching the Civil War. I mean, you teach here at Missouri State both undergraduate and graduate classes in Civil War and Reconstruction and Missouri history as well. Often to soon-to-be high school teachers. Can you outline how your research and your teaching seeks to address some of the common misconceptions about the Civil War, about how it is taught in the United States, how it is remembered in the United States, and what that popular image is in the United States of the Civil War?
We are certainly in a moment where what the war meant and memories of the Civil War are still very much with us. We have, within the past few years, quite active debates about objects of memorialization and which parts of our past should we honor. And we are still dealing with the ways that the Civil War will have been taught in the generations afterward in the South. Because after the Civil War, there will come a concerted effort in the defeated Confederacy to remake what we call social studies curriculum. They were having a fight over what kids should and should not be taught in schools. And it is an effort led principally by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And what the women in this organization believed was that their children were being mistaught what the war was about. And what they're going to steadfastly maintain is that the war had not been about slavery, that it had been about states' rights, and that their Confederate forebears had been honorable, and that this had been a lost cause, but it had been a noble cause. And so this kind of sustained effort is going to lead to generations of curriculum. And it gets reinforced in popular memory through films like Gone with the Wind and Birth of a Nation that really minimize the impacts of slavery, and it minimizes the revolutionary meanings of the war. And in teaching the Civil War to university students, I find that this continues to be an issue that some of my students bring into the classroom. That they've grown up learning that this was a struggle about states' rights and federalism. And although that is true, that there are ideological dimensions to the war, that the South was relying upon their understanding of a limited national government, they were quite direct, the Southern states were, in what particular rights they felt imperiled by Abraham Lincoln's election. And if you read each of the ordinances that the seceding Confederate states wrote upon choosing to leave the Union, they make clear that they are leaving because of slavery and that they believed a the election of an anti-slavery Illinois president was a threat to their economic interest. It was a threat to their political influence, and that this was a war that without slavery there would not have been a war. In early 1861, the new Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, delivers a speech in which he declares that slavery is the cornerstone of their new Republican experiment, and that the Confederacy was going to improve upon the mistakes of the founders of the United States. And he directly points out that what Jefferson had written in 1776 in the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, Stephens argues that was wrong, and that the Confederate States had recognized that not all people are created equal, and that their new society was built upon the recognition of racial inequality. And so my classes, I strongly encourage, and I build into my lessons, taking students into the primary documents and showing them what the people of the Civil War generation themselves wrote, and setting those documents within their historical context, and trying to wrestle with them in all of their complexity, and to read those sources, and then to follow the war, and to continue to study primary sources, and to come away with the argument that the war was not about slavery is, I would say, willfully disingenuous. It is a willfully ignorant reading of the past that is at odds with what the people at that time had themselves said.
And I think it also attempts to isolate different causes when they're all interconnected. You mentioned, for example, the question of states' rights. Of course, the question was states' rights to what? Mm-hmm. What's the right they're trying to protect? It's slavery. So, yes, it's about states' rights, but that is connected to slavery. And then, of course, there's the question of tariffs and economic interests. But again, that's connected to the fact that in the South of the United States, you have a plantation economy that is based on exporting its cotton to the mills of the United Kingdom. And you have a North that wants greater protectionism. And so all of these issues lead back to slavery. I think, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but I think often some of the hesitancy of Americans to face the Civil War and the centrality of slavery is because slavery is viewed purely through a moral lens. And of course, there's a moral lens, but it isn't just a moral question. It was an entire socioeconomic structure. It was an entire society that was predicated on the existence of slavery. It's not just there were bad people and good people, but rather that you had a society based on slavery, one that was not based on slavery, and those two societies came into conflict. Not everybody who was fighting against slavery cared about black people. I think, they may have opposed slavery, but for their own economic interest, because obviously if you're a small farmer, you're going to have a harder time competing with somebody who has a giant plantation and has people who work for free on it.
That's right. And there are layers to the pro-slavery ideology. There are layers to the anti-slavery movement in the North that I want my students to really reckon with, that trying to separate history into these binaries of all good or all bad reduces people in their messiness. And what they see when they look at the anti-slavery movement is that, yes, you do have some very outspoken and very determined abolitionists who are going to attack slavery for moral reasons. Many of them are formerly enslaved people like Frederick Douglass. These are the people that are pressing Lincoln from the start of the war to emancipate the slaves, and that once you attack slavery, it is the foundation of Southern economy, Southern society, Southern politics, and that will be the surest way to end the war. But those more radical, zealous abolitionists, they're far outnumbered by the people you're describing who were in the 1840s and 1850s calling themselves free soilers, people who were opposed to slavery on economic grounds. And the economic grounds were that they believed, and these are overwhelmingly farmers of modest means, white Western farmers, who believed that the West should be reserved for people like themselves, and that they should not be forced to compete against wealthy Southern aristocrats. And so they will focus upon the fight for Kansas in 1854 and the struggles that follow, that it is a struggle for who should have the West, white farmers like themselves or the wealthy Southern aristocracy. What you say about the tariff is another good illustration of how, as teachers, it is incumbent upon us that we ask students to consider the past in all of the tangled ways in which the issues of the past were interconnected. And you can't talk about the tariff without talking about slavery. If you wanted to cherry pick your evidence, you could find a speech from Jefferson Davis here or another Southern secessionist there. And that particular speech would make clear that, yes, they are quite angry about the tariff and the way they feel that it punishes Southern consumers. But when you set that single speech against the larger body of their writings, you see that it's part of a whole constellation of grievances that they have, which are overwhelmingly grounded in their anxieties about the future of slavery.
So how do we avoid this binary historic thinking? You say you still have students to this day coming in with this sort of binary north-south idea. I mean, I would assume many of them do, and then you also still have students who have this kind of lost cause almost mythology about the Civil War. But how do we address that so that a college education is not necessary in order to understand the Civil War? I mean, it's a part of all of us. It's shaped who we are today, this country that we live in. We should all have a genuine understanding of this time in history, but you can't. And oftentimes, you're not going to have high school students poring over primary source documents. How can we teach this at lower grades in order to avoid this kind of binary thinking and have a more holistic historic outlook on the past?
The responsibility of teachers at the K through 12 level, especially in middle schools and high schools, I think their part in this is vital. And so making sure that these young people come through the university equipped with the skills of thinking like a historian and looking at the past and looking at the things people said in the past and not running away from them and looking at them in a clear-eyed fashion. They don't have the time. There's simply too much material for them to cover to take high school and junior high students in the same way through all of the secession ordinances. But I think that with the training they receive here, they can begin to do that. And I think you demystify the past when you show people in 1861 were people with their own fears and aspirations and biases. Part of our training as historians is to identify biases and try to make sense of them. And that's certainly something that students can do in high schools and in middle schools. Young people are sharp, often sharper than grown-ups will give them credit for. And we don't do them a favor whenever we try to hide them from the difficult issues in our nation's past, because our nation is still grappling with many of those same issues today.
So would you say then the current political atmosphere and questions relating to race today in the United States hamper the teaching of the Civil War in a clear-eyed way?
I think that the politicization of social studies curriculum and curriculum more broadly, I think that this is a real challenge for historians and for our civic culture, because when we as a society are going to draw hard and fast lines about, well, we should not talk about this because talking about this is uncomfortable, I think that it is it's corrosive, and I think it has a real harmful effect upon the dialogue that we as Americans have. In a self-governing society, we need an informed populace. And we need to know how the past has shaped the choices that we face today. And willfully saying, well, we should not talk about these things, it inhibits real problem solving. And I think that, unfortunately, the intersections of politics and school curricula are not new. This goes back to what I discussed a moment ago with the United Daughters of the Confederacy, saying that, well, there are just some things that children should be protected from. And therefore, in the absence of not teaching them about A, we'll only teach them about B, when B is itself a distortion, a willful distortion of the past. That is going to cause and reinforce problems that we have.
So, as a kind of final question, then, for people who are interested in learning more about the Civil War, do you have any good book recommendations, either old books or new books, that you would, recommend to people who want to get a good picture of the Civil War, who want to perhaps tackle some of the latest historiography on the topic?
Yeah, there has been a tremendous upsurge in interest in the border states like Missouri, Kentucky, and elsewhere. Christopher Phillips has written a masterful book called The Rivers Ran Backward, looking at the middle border. Carrie Lee Merritt has a tremendous book on the South called Masterless Men. There's been really fascinating work on emancipation and how emancipation was a landmark achievement, but still brought with it real challenges. So Jim Downs has written a book called Sick from Freedom, and Amy Merle Taylor has written a book called Embattled Freedom. There's just so much good scholarship out there. I can't name all of them, but yes, if people want to get into this material, there's no shortage.
Well, we'll definitely put some links to those books, as well as your book, which is on the Borderlands as well, in the description.
Well, thank you, Dr. Neely, for joining us. This has been Talking History Extra, a podcast from KSMU.